Hi, I'm John Byrne with Poets&Quants. Welcome to a really incredible webinar that we're going to have here today. I have Matt Symonds in Paris. Hi, Matt. Matt is the co-founder of Fortuna Admissions, the admissions consulting firm, but he's a longtime veteran of the whole MBA scene. He actually had the first franchise, the Kaplan franchise in Europe many years ago. He's a writer at Forbes as well.
No,
and he's my partner in our conference business called Center Court, which we'll be having in London pretty soon. We'll talk a little bit about that. But really, we're here to talk about who really gets into Harvard and Stanford. Matt and his team at Fortuna did some remarkable sleuthing, looking through LinkedIn profiles, hundreds and hundreds of them, to see who really gets in. You know, these stats that we're going to present to you are never in a class profile that's published by a school. And on some level, frankly, they're embarrassing to the schools. They suggest an incredibly elitist admissions policy. I'm just going to give a few tidbits here. For example, 37% of the last class admitted to Stanford, that's the year before, are from an Ivy League undergraduate institution. At Harvard, it's 23%. Roughly 1 in 5 had at one point worked for one of three firms, McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, which suggests to me that, yeah, these are terrific candidates, but it also suggests to me a diversity problem that doesn't show up in class profile statistics. So I'm gonna ask you, Matt, for top line, what did you really find out when you went through all these numbers? And I have to give Matt's son a great deal of credit for doing this because he did a lot of the legwork.
That's right, the family business. I'd love it if he was a legacy applicant. But, well, as you know, John, you mentioned Center Court, which late April. And of course, we get the chance to sit down with the deans and with the admissions directors at these top schools. And I can remember, what was it, 2 years ago at the Center Court event in San Francisco. And we had Kirsten Moss, who at a previous stage in her career had been the admissions director at Harvard Business School, who was joining us just 3 weeks in to the new position that she had at Stanford GSB, and a wonderful hire the school made in persuading Kirsten to join them. Sure. I can see her sitting on the panel at Center Court saying, I have a real problem with Stanford's GMAT score. Now, if you remember, go back 2-3 years, it was at a record 737, eye-popping average. And her point, of course, was that as Stanford, and indeed any of these top schools, craft the diversity of their incoming class every year. My colleagues at Fortuna always say it was the best part of the job, as they thought about all of these individuals, their stories, how that comes together, and the chemistry that they're making for the future MBA classroom. You know, she felt that 75 minutes of data sufficiency or critical reasoning really didn't do it for her in terms of the sort of backgrounds, experience, accomplishments, stories, curiosity that they were looking for. We hope that many of today's audience will join us. We're doing a lot of live streaming from the London event at Center Court with your questions to those deans and directors, and we'll have hopefully many of those top schools with us. You mentioned this idea
you'll get
about
to meet Matt and I
typical
as well. I should point out, you will get to meet Matt and I, and unlike other conferences of this sort, we not only host, we guide, we orchestrate, we grab people, have good conversations with them, bring them up to the people that we think should know them. This is not your ordinary, typical, vanilla MBA admissions event. We should point that out.
And of course, people come to those events, they've looked at school websites, and what do they find for Harvard and Stanford? produce pretty much the same class profile. In fact, if you look for the Harvard class profile of 2020, you can't find it anymore. Well, you certainly will be able to in the Poets and Quants archive, but they only have their class of 2021 figures. And as we show on the slides we've prepared for this webinar together, it's pretty basic stuff. You know, these schools, I suppose at the front of the first things that you see is just the sheer volume of applications that these two schools attract, and embedded in that, the fact that Harvard's MBA class is about 2.5 times the size of the GSB, just how selective Stanford is. Usually it's what, 1 in every 18 or 19 applicants that make the grade. They share their average GMAT scores, they share their GPAs. So those are the basics.
Let me just say this, Matt.
They talk about gender diversity.
When I look at this, I see a lot of blandness, but I also see a disingenuous attempt to make it appear as if the class is far more diverse than it actually is. When you look at, for example, the number of undergraduate institutions, you might think that they're far more open to public universities, state colleges, and things like that, when in fact they are not. You look at the number of organizations that people come from, you know, 540 plus. It just is a lie in the sense that we're looking at a lot of tokenism in both those numbers. And I'm going to just make one point. Those numbers were never revealed by these schools until after we did our initial analysis of the feeder colleges and feeder companies to these schools, which was embarrassing to these schools, which is the only reason why these numbers even exist today in class profiles.
Right,
okay.
Right. So I guess if we look at those raw, there's an average of 2 or 3 Imperial College, Indian Institute of Technology, or Berkeley and Boston College. But the reality is we're going to see, and we figured, you know, the schools weren't going to help us with this deep dive that we undertook.
No way.
And so LinkedIn became our friend with all of its, you know, incredible numbers of profiles on there. Probably a couple of caveats. We ultimately managed to track down the academic and professional profiles of over 95% of Harvard's MBA class of 2020. In the case of the GSB, that was about 85%. So you reassured me that that was statistically significant and reliable. And you know, what then emerges from those different stories. So we'd love to think that this is, you know, the most detailed deep dive analysis that has ever been made public, looking at these two fairly conservative and fairly secretive schools. They do talk about diversity, but when you really start to explore, so the areas that we were looking at were colleges and companies. And of course, what we'll get to see here is how quickly it clusters around Ivy League schools. You know, as you then compare them to UC schools in California, University of Michigan, Michigan State, and of course the international universities. As you're going to see, there really are some very dominant players that are programs. We also thought it would be really interesting, given that the schools provide a fairly lightweight sort of summary that says, well, yeah, this year we had 36% that had a STEM undergrad background. We had 47% that had studied economics and business. But again, it's, you know, those are sort of big shaded areas on a pie chart. And so with the research that we did, we actually tracked down every undergraduate degree that these Harvard and Stanford MBAs had done in the years previously. It throws up some very interesting data, including the fact that if you come from certain schools, you might be able to get away with less work experience, fewer years of work experience than some of the others. So, I mean, your point to me is this elite or is this eclectic?
Well, if you go back to the number in the previous slide about how many students come from how many different undergraduate institutions at Harvard, for example, the truth is that based on your analysis, only half, rather than half of all the people earn their undergraduate degrees for only 24 universities, only 24, half. So you look at that number that they publish and it makes it look like, okay, you know, I got a chance. It's much more of an open race, and it really is a meritocracy. And then you look at your stats and you say, what? How is it possible that half of the entire class at Harvard Business School can come from only 24 universities? Because there are, the discrete Ivies, then there are public Ivies, then there are non-Ivies that really are, the top liberal arts colleges and things like that. And 24 universities for half the class? Come on. Now, one limitation that I'm going to just point out to everyone.
A stronger statistician than I am would say, well, if over 50% of the class of the applicants in that pool were coming from those 24 schools, then
that's right.
That pipeline
and that's the one limitation.
That's
the one limitation we have, because we don't know the denominator.
Right.
So we don't know how many people actually applied who had worked at McKinsey, Bain, BCG. How many people who applied actually went to an Ivy League school? Mm-hmm. We only know who was admitted and enrolled. So that is one limitation to the research, and we probably have to suggest that. There's a lot of self-selection that goes on when you apply to these elite schools, so that, in fact, if you look at the applicant pool, it probably would skew more toward Ivy League or these top universities, and more toward, big prestigious employers like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Google and MBB. But nonetheless, I can't imagine that even given that limitation, the stats would be reflective of a more equal playing field. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I mean, the schools promising. The schools are promising the best of the best of the best, and I guess it's open for debate where you get the best from. But we're going to talk a little bit later on, I think, in the webinar about what the schools are looking for. They talk about academic rigor. They talk about intellectual vitality and curiosity, and I guess their baseline for that is, as we see here, to heavily recruit from top universities that I guess. Coming out of high school, we're attracting smart people with strong SAT scores. Now, I guess as we get into those numbers, the fact that Stanford is then boasting a 3.72 GPA average, from any of the schools that are then feeding into these two MBA programs, these are academic high achievers. And I actually think that one of the things that really emerges from this is just how much weight Harvard and Stanford place on your academic background. The GMAT, and I guess Kirsten said it somewhat publicly at Center Court. That's a 75-minute section of quant. Okay, it's going to show that you can handle numbers, but really, if you spent 3 or 4 years at one of the top institutions and have done very well academically, thankfully it doesn't stop there. But I guess as we sort of jump into those numbers, because we see the parallels on the recruiter side. You mentioned MBB, of course, that in the case of Harvard Business School represents about 21%, 1 in 5 of those getting into the program. The big banks, the private equity, venture capital firms, interesting to see how the number of entrepreneurs that applied and got into Stanford, a much smaller class, compared to the numbers getting into Harvard Business School. So lots to get to. I guess let's start with the schools. We just put together the top 10. Great. Because as you had pointed out, in the case of Stanford, 53% of the class, in fact, came from just institutions, almost all of them from the United States. In the case of Stanford, there was Pontificia Católica from Chile that provided 5 of the Stanford class. And again, let's not forget, Stanford is a small, big school. It's only 419 students, and they really are picking them in 1s and 2s. Stanford, as you look at these numbers, obviously isn't afraid to take those coming out of Harvard's pool, at least from the undergraduate level, and those two dominate on both sides, whereas Harvard and UPenn, which includes the Wharton School, are the two that dominate at Harvard. So you'll see a lot of those Ivy League schools in there. Interesting to note how
not
well
only
Duke.
Look at Stanford's numbers. Okay, so outside of Stanford, which is not in the traditional Ivy League, although all of us consider it in the Ivy League, all of the Ivy League schools are right at the top. before anybody else.
They are. Scan down the list. Where's MIT? You know, there are a few that are notable by their absence. Columbia made it onto the top 10 list for Stanford. They're a little bit further down in Harvard's list. Notre Dame, placed 18 into Harvard in the class of 2020, and they had pretty strong figures. I think, what did they have? 6 of Stanford's class. And again, as you always, think about that ratio of Harvard's MBA is about 2.5 times the size of Stanford. A school like Notre Dame is placing in strong numbers. You also see some interesting sort of subsets. Georgetown. Many of those Stanford admits were at the Walsh School for foreign policy. So clearly they have a penchant for certain profiles. So the deep dive analysis that we did identified all 167 institutions that were feeder colleges into Stanford, and I think around 300 into Harvard. The big names dominate. And then very quickly, you're down to schools that provided 1s and 2s. I think well over half of the feeder colleges to Harvard provided just one individual versus these that we have on the screen now. As you look specifically at the Ivy League, and interesting to note that Stanford is not a member of that illustrious sports club, but they've taken even more Ivy League graduates in the class of 2020, 1 in 3. Pretty much, 30%.
37%.
Yeah, well, that's 37. I don't know. I ran my numbers again ahead of the webinar. I'm pretty comfortable with that one. But okay. I think if you add Stanford to the mix, then you end up at 37% through 9 schools. Yeah. Harvard is what, one in 4. They dominate, and you can see that little logo for Columbia right down at the bottom there. That was just 1.6% of the class. So yeah, Ivy League is clearly up front. You didn't see many from the University of Chicago at either school. You just saw 1s and 2s from great schools like the University of Michigan. Part of the challenge, we see Stanford with their scholarship.
So isn't
to attract Midwest applicants.
But
they're not getting them in the schools.
Okay, all these schools, there's not a single public university, not even what are called the public Ivies like Michigan, UVA, UNC, UT Austin, Wisconsin, UCLA, Berkeley, and not even those which have massive numbers of graduates every single year are among these top schools at the very top of the list. Isn't that shocking?
It certainly is. You go back to that theme of diversity.
And we're talking public Ivies, no less. Now, when you get down to lower levels like, UC Riverside, UC Santa Barbara, UC San Diego, if you get one, you're lucky at either of these schools. Or Penn State. Absolutely. Penn State, which graduates so many people, very small representation here.
Well, I mean, there's a school like the University of Oklahoma that I mentioned earlier that I think had 3 admits to Stanford last year. They were all in mechanical or chemical engineering. Perhaps there were only 3 that applied. If we look at the ratios, you would have expected close to 60 applicants from the University of Oklahoma. So, those guys, if you look at their admissions success rate, in many ways, they perhaps had enjoyed far more success. That would certainly be true for all of those Chilean graduates from Pontificia. To get 5 into the Stanford program in a given year is a phenomenal number. But it's very top heavy for the sort of 15 to 20 schools, and you don't then see that sort of eclectic spread. Now, it would be very interesting to ask Harvard and Stanford MBA students what they want. Do they say, we actually feel that we've got far too much of the Ivy League here, far too many of the familiar faces. I'm looking to build up a network that's not just international, but even, across the best schools in the country. Or would they say, this is how it should be? I want to be surrounded by Ivy League undergrad in my MBA classroom. So certainly, I guess, as we then follow that pipeline through, there's also an important stakeholder in all of this, and that's the recruiters. I think one of the themes that I think we draw from is the upper hand that certain applicants, either from their school networks or the employers that they work with through their recommenders, who that start, they have a head start. They have great networks that they can tap into, people that can speak on their behalf. And I think, with even the best efforts of Kirsten or Chad, all of that, those are very important voices that they need to listen to. So yeah, you do wonder if there's this sort of self-serving bubble. Of course, the schools are capable of change. If we were looking at these numbers 10, 12 years ago, both schools would have only had 30 or 31% women in the MBA classrooms. With these numbers, we're looking at between 41 and 43%. And of course, in the class of 2021, record numbers at both schools. Stanford brought in, 47% women to this year's MBA classroom. I think they would admit that with the efforts that they've made and a success that they're starting to see with that move towards gender balance, I think for them, the battleground now is minority students and the sort of diversity that you're describing. There's every chance that many of those 1s and 2s that were taken from schools from the South, from the Midwest.
So here's and that's a good point you're making, because of these statistics that we're seeing, I would bet that more minority candidates and more women come from these other schools that are less represented in the sample. So in other words, if you are a white male applying from Oklahoma, applying from Rutgers, applying from State College of someplace, your chances of getting in are even slimmer than these statistics would even suggest, because I would bet that a lot of the people coming from the onesies and twosies schools are minority or female.
Well, I guess that's you're laying down the challenge for the next deep dive that we do for 2021 to bring in those sort of components.
Indeed.
As we take, this was something I found fascinating. Harvard and Stanford, perhaps more than the other M7 schools and the top schools in the last 2-3 years, that have seen a fairly dramatic decline in the number of international applicants. Now, both Harvard and Stanford have kept their international intake fairly strong, fairly stable, around, well, in the case of Stanford, as we show here, 42% of the class. A considerable number of them, I think, will be dual citizens. But what really struck me was that of those international students, almost half of them had studied undergrad in the United States. So there's still that endorsement, I think, of top schools in the US. That's what we feel most comfortable with. That's where we're recruiting from, and that really sort of comes through in those numbers. Again, Stanford with a much smaller class, that they had this spike in Chilean students. I think there were a handful from 3 or 4 institutions in the UK. There were very small numbers from India. We maybe didn't pick up a few Chinese applicants, or applicants that don't have the same level of visibility on the LinkedIn platform. But for Harvard, over what about a third of the international students had studied in 3 countries: in India, UK, and Canada. It's quite an achievement for Canada, which is a population of 37, 38 million, compared to the 1.3 billion in India. So to get 22 admits from 9 universities. And as you go down the list, you'll find, I think it's Brazil number 4, Australia is in the top 5 or 6. You'll find France. So clearly there's an advantage for that international applicant who has already completed undergrad in the United States, perhaps has then gone on to consolidate the first steps of their career, also in the US. But it felt a little disingenuous that they are talking about such a strong international pool, and yet a great many of them are likely to have already had a footprint in the US when they applied.
And Matt, I should point out to everyone that we're going to be taking questions for the last 15 minutes of the presentation. We already have a few, and we'll get to them a little bit later on.
Right. So what through in those typical class profiles of any of the schools, and as we look to tackle Wharton and others next, is, so what did people study? Economics was the clear winner among the top feeder schools. You had big numbers from Yale, from Princeton, from Harvard, that studied economics. The further down you went, it was interesting. A school like Duke had great diversity. Chinese studies, archaeology students. There was quite an eclectic mix there. I think many of the schools that provided applicants in 1s or 2s, that's where you would see the BBA program from schools like USC, UT Austin, you mentioned earlier, Berkeley and Michigan. You'd see a lot of engineers from the international crowd. But yeah, economics was a clear winner, and those that have the patience can go through all 300 plus universities, because we actually identified and shared every single major or degree that people had taken. I think that matters too. That it's you're not seeing many studying art history. We've seen this shift already away from liberal arts. There are more and more successful applicants to these top schools that have a STEM background. That certainly came through. I think it was what was the top at Wharton was finance. Perhaps no surprise. I think that was similar at NYU, and then history was the most recurrent undergrad at a school like Dartmouth. But this final point, this bullet point on this slide, really interested me. That apart from my spelling mistake, of course, it's HBS admits. Their intake, the Harvard admits in the class of 2020 who had an Ivy League undergraduate education typically had less work experience than the non-Ivy League graduates. Now, part of this could be explained, of course, by the 2+2 program, where individuals are applying in the senior year of college. They don't have 4 or 5 years of professional experience to point to, or some incredibly successful startup, or the impact that they've had working in the nonprofit sector. So of course, for HBS is 2+2, and then Stanford and their deferred enrollment, they're relying much more heavily on academic achievement when they look at those seniors applying at that early stage. So that, it could have some impact, but just this idea that if you have an Ivy League education, maybe you can get away with 6 months fewer on your resume, and that will be fine for Harvard. So are all standards the same? This is where my son did this incredible work looking at null hypotheses and finding out what was relevant, what might not be, and he showed me this particular finding.
Yep, definitely.
On the employer side, you talked about, and it really is dominance. I mean, look at this, McKinsey, BCG, and Bain. We're looking at 2 sets of numbers for each of these feeder companies. The bigger number in the case of McKinsey, 29 to Stanford and 82 to Harvard Business School, that is the number of successful admits that had McKinsey on their resume since graduating from college. So it's a full-time position, whether they started their career and then moved on and did other things. But McKinsey, BCG, and Bain, you gave the numbers early, absolutely dominant, and perhaps speaks to a number of factors, the networks that those individuals benefit from that I mentioned earlier. But clearly, these are among the most prized employers for graduating college students, and they have very rigorous recruitment standards. The case method that you have to sort of really dive into for your MBB interviews. I think that provides a level of reassurance for the admissions office. If you're good enough for McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, you've already got a head start. Also, a lot of industry breadth. In the space of 2 or 3 years, you may have worked in laminar flow in aeronauticals, you've worked in Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and the latest fintech ideas. They're being deployed across so many industries and sectors. And I guess as the admissions office is looking for those voices of experience and perspectives, that the top consulting firms, and include Deloitte in the list. They made a great showing among the big 4 in both of those school lists. The number 4 in the Stanford list, They're number 5 in the Harvard list. So really does it for these schools. Anyone that's wondering where the private equity and venture capital crowd are, they're certainly very present on the deeper dive that identified over 500 employers that had fed people to these schools. But you see much smaller numbers. Bain Capital crept onto the list. So yeah, it's the big consulting firms and it's the big banks. I want to come back to the big banks because there's another trend I think that we see in terms of it's great to start your career, whether at Citi, at Barclays, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Goldman, Morgan, and JP Morgan. But just how many people then move on after perhaps 2 years of a rotational program or 3 years, then they get an interesting position working in PE or VC. And that seems to really work for these two schools. So it's a great place to start your career. Far fewer of those individuals are still with JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley by the time that they actually apply to these schools.
What does it say about the diversity of the class? I mean, is Harvard and Stanford nothing more than finishing school for consultants and investment bankers?
Well, it's certainly a great place for them to build the next steps of their career. You know, for many of them, perhaps having worked the sort of hours involved at MBB or the investment banks, actually the rigor of business school, it might seem like 2 fairly light years for them. And for many, you know, we talk about that triple jump that people will make where they switch geographies, they switch sector, and they switch function. Of course, some will return. I think we see many more of the McKinsey, BCG, Bains going back to those companies after, you know, perhaps doing 1 year at a school like INSEAD that places such high numbers to MBB. You know, 2 years, you've got that internship between year 1 and year 2. You explore. You've got, you know, you're surrounded by an incredible mix of talented, ambitious, open-minded classmates. Who knows where the next steps of your career might go? Consulting is one of those options. I mean, you know, both of us, when we reflect on Stanford's recruiting numbers, what is it? 1/3 of the class has not confirmed a position coming out of the MBA program within 3 months. Now that statistic, most deans would never sleep at night if they knew that, you know, 33% of their graduates hadn't found a job yet. But there's a confidence among Stanford MBAs, whether it's the next, you know, high growth, fast track unicorn, or something else that they're looking to pursue. So, yeah, they've got certainly remarkable networks, and they're set for the next steps of their career. I guess then you start to, you know, see further down where you bring in those voices from the Fortune 100. It was interesting to see, you know, the oil and gas sector with the likes of ExxonMobil that had 8 admits to Harvard, followed by Shell and Chevron with 5. Saudi Aramco, the world's highest market cap company in the world, they provided 3. And even GE's subsidiary Baker Hughes, they had another 3. You know, you see this. We saw a lot of applicants coming from oil and gas about 4 or 5 years ago. You know, oil was $28 a barrel. The majors were laying people off, Schlumberger, Odebrecht, and Big Oil. So going to business school made a lot of sense. I mean, you've often written Poets and Quants about how tight certainly the US job market is right now, and perhaps people, you know, postponing their business school plans. But Harvard, Stanford, I don't think people would put off those plans if they actually got an offer from the admissions offices of Boston and Palo Alto. So I mean, I think one of the other things that you see, say again?
When I sit back and I look at both the undergraduate institutions where these students came from, and then the companies, at least at the top level, what these statistics suggest to me is an incredibly risk-adverse admissions process, where admissions people are taking very few bets on people. Instead, what they're looking for is an undergraduate institution that is already highly selective and has a very fine filter and is filtered out a lot of people. And then they're looking for an employer who does the same thing, highly selective employment practices. And then on top of that, they're still looking for a high GMATs and GPAs. So everything is aligned not only to find quote unquote the best people, but to ensure that they don't make an admissions mistake.
Mm. Mm. I mean, as you know, at Fortuna, I have nearly 40 former admissions directors,
Yes.
associate deans, and associate directors of the top 10 business schools. And we talk about, of course, the processes that they have in place, and committee discussions, and already those established ties that they have with the recruiters, both as feeders and then as recruiting graduates as they come out of the MBA program. Caroline and Judith talk about past performance as one of the best predictors of future achievement or success. And I think, here you have the safe bet. And I think perhaps this is the entrepreneur in both of us that's talking, we lament perhaps not having a greater diversity for you created a site dedicated to the misfits. We see genius, and as Steve Jobs framed it, those individuals with a level of vision that are the ones that are going to, as Stanford likes to put it, they're the ones that talk about change lives and change the world. I think that there's an inbred confidence, perhaps. I've got my Ivy League education. I've worked at one of the major blue chip firms, and naturally one of these business schools is the next. So there's a pathway, there's a comfortable pathway, and I do certainly 930 individuals in Boston, and 420 in Palo Alto. They can take risks. They can see individuals that perhaps not all of us had the stellar academic moment at the age of 18, 19, 20 years old. But there are other ways to be able to demonstrate that. And I sometimes, looking at these numbers, think that we're fairly safe with this. That much safer coming out of the US Navy, both in terms of at undergrad. I think Naval Academy scored much higher than West Point in these classes, and much bigger numbers that target, but certainly are admitted to Harvard Business School. We talked about the 3 M's of Harvard: McKinsey, Mormons, and military. You certainly see it in these numbers with the US Navy and the US Army. And the great majority of them, as these numbers reflect, are using business school as the transition to civilian life. Clearly, Harvard is attracting many more of them than Stanford.
Right.
Now, in terms of, we spoke about MBB. It's about 1 in 3 had them on their resume when they applied to the GSB. Similar numbers coming through for Harvard Business School. Interestingly, in that breakdown, both Harvard and Stanford have more female students that were consultants pre-MBA than males. You see a complete reverse, a far steeper reverse when clearly there are more male bankers at both of these schools. But for the class of 2020, there were more women that were consultants than men admitted.
By a large margin or little?
No, it was about 51.5%, 52%. So it's fairly gender balanced. Very interesting one was those coming from industry, and how many successful women applicants. This was particularly for Harvard Business School. And as the school looks for patterns of leadership, perhaps the idea of imagining them in a male-dominated offshore oil rig, or whatever that industrial setting that they were in, rolling up their sleeves, working with certainly with many of the successful clients that we've had at Fortuna, being able to talk about how they managed to successfully thrive in that sort of male-dominated environment is something that has connected with the admissions office in sharing their story. And almost all of those from the industrial sector were women in this particular one. Tech was about half and half. I think on the software side, it was dominated by men, and tech firms at the product management level, there was far more gender balance.
This is really interesting.
In terms of,
again, since Harvard and Stanford are accepting more women with consulting backgrounds than men today, the percentage of women who go into consulting is quite small compared to men. So these statistics loom even larger than they might appear at first glance, because I know McKinsey, all the consulting firms have made a major effort to recruit more young women. But I would bet that it's probably not much more than 30%, maybe even less at most of these firms. So that the fact is really remarkable. That what that means to me is that if you're a white male and you work for McKinsey, Bain, BCG, is despite what these overall statistics show about how favored you might be, you may end up at Wharton or Columbia or MIT. Not so bad. Okay, not bad at all. But obviously, Harvard and Stanford are showing a preference for women here.
Right. Well, when you look at subsets, I mean, yeah, the white male banker is clearly an overrepresented profile in any of the applicant pools of the M7, and
Sure.
Harvard and Stanford probably at the top. What was really interesting is how these firms act as a great first step. I think we saw, what was it, as many as 11 admits from Credit Suisse and Citi and Barclays. But none of them, or perhaps one of them, was still with the firm as they were successfully admitted to either of these two schools. They'd all gone on after the first two, usually it was about a 2.5 year average. In the first 2 or 3 years, had then made a move. Some, of course, had stayed in their industry. Many then took that chance to move to, whether it was BlackRock, KKR, and sort of spread their wings and gain extra experience. Makes sense, right? I mean, if they've already proved their worth in the hothouse of investment banking, to then gain that additional experience in private equity, that's a strong professional resume that you're presenting to any school. So I guess anyone that's listening that says, well, my second year is up at Goldman or at Morgan Stanley, lift your heads up and think about, if you've got thinking about these top schools in a 2 or 3 year time frame, what's the best plan? Do you apply at this early stage in your career, or do you now make a move and gain additional experience? Certainly from what we're seeing on these resumes is that the preference for Harvard and Stanford is the individual that has made a move after 2.
Hey Matt, we're getting a good number of questions, and I think we might want to turn to a few of them because they're pretty darn interesting, I think, and I think they would help a lot of people. So here's one who is currently employed by Bain and Company, and this person is wondering how I can best differentiate myself amongst the MBB applicants. Any thoughts, advice based on your experience?
I mean, clearly, any of these successful applicants from MBB, we talked earlier about just how many are applying. Business school is, for so many of you, a natural next step, whether you want to make partner or you want to make the transition that we were describing. And there's a lot of room. In fact, Harvard and Stanford are very explicit. Harvard says, okay, we've read your resume. And obviously what they're finding out about the academic and professional background, and we've read your letters of recommendation, which are both professional. So they've got this wonderful context for the career that you've already built. And Harvard then says, what more should we know about you? So I think that you use perhaps your academic success in undergrad and the career that you've built with Bain as tremendous building blocks, but it's that what more piece. And I think those that we see it a lot. We've last year we had around a 50% success rate with HBS applicants, many from MBB and the Big Four, and it was interesting just how many of them, whether in their private lives, in their community, had some level of real engagement. They hadn't started walking puppies at the animal shelter a month before they applied to these business schools, things that they'd been doing for 18 months, for 4 years, and were able to, really speak about it with passion and purpose, because it's quite explicit. Harvard and Stanford, my colleagues that were admissions officers at these schools, they said, you start talking to us about another PowerPoint deck that you put together for a client, or another M&A deal that you were working on, explicitly use those essays perhaps to share a far more personal narrative about choices that you've made, a path that you've taken, things that you're really passionate about, and that you can prove it. Back to Center Court, when Kirsten was talking about applicants to Stanford, they see this whole change lives and change the world thing, and so many applicants from Bain and other great firms we'll start to talk about how they're going to change the world, and whether that's clean drinking water solutions or, solving poverty, which of course, if you could achieve any small part of either of those two, would be phenomenal. But if they don't see clean drinking water in your resume when you've described that as your big vision, it's going to make the school wonder, just how legitimate or just how real is that vision. So obviously, looking into your background, Bain will have kept you very, very busy in the early years of your career. The schools know the sort of hours that you're working, but I think the applicants that truly stand out, whether through college and even now in the first stages of their professional lives, have found the time, they've carved out the time to make commitments which demonstrate patterns. Ultimately, they demonstrate patterns of leadership. Both of these schools, we talk about Harvard and leadership. I think both of them want to see whether in a professional setting, in a community setting, whether it was a club that you were involved with at college, how they see these sort of recurrent patterns of leadership and impact, how you make a difference. So Bain's a great place to start. And I think now it's to really explore the personal story to find those things that really help you to stand out.
Here's a question. What percentage of the incoming class at these schools are business owners or entrepreneurs?
Very few. And interestingly, the entrepreneurs that we identified almost invariably had the title of founder and CEO. So clearly it was the owners. It wasn't someone that joined the startup in the early stages. They were one of the founders or the co-founders. And the numbers for Stanford are much, much higher, certainly as a percentage of the class. I think the actual real numbers of entrepreneurs going into Stanford, we're still, compared to the banks and the consulting firms, big tech and others that we're talking about, those numbers are fairly small. And I would encourage you to obviously download this deep dive, because I think we also identify that within 15 or 20 entrepreneurs that were admitted to Stanford, and what was it, 12 to 14 admitted to Harvard Business School, it wasn't smartphone apps that they'd been developing, and it was great to see that it was entrepreneurship across a complete sector spread. It wasn't all about technology. Some people had built restaurant chains, and others were doing it in the social enterprise. Yeah, the numbers are, I guess, fairly modest. That's what, fewer than 5% in the Stanford classroom, but nearly all of them had the CEO and founder title.
Right. Here's another good one. Do you have any data regarding students who already have a master's degree and apply to a business school?
So I think that we saw, and Heidi and Theo that crunched so many of these numbers, it was a labor of love. I think that we saw somewhere between 17 and 20% with a graduate degree. There's a caveat there, because of course, as we were working with LinkedIn profiles, a significant number of these individuals are applying for dual degrees. The schools themselves report that as many as about 25% of their MBA students are pursuing a dual degree at Stanford or at Harvard, whether that's at the Kennedy School, whether that's the MBA and an MS combined in computer science at Stanford. So very often they would start and do their first year in the engineering school, at the D School, at the Kennedy School, and then would begin the MBA in the second year. So it was sometimes a little bit tricky to extrapolate, but I think probably it would be safe to say that somewhere between 15, 17% already had a graduate degree when they were applying to school.
Now here's a question from someone who's working at Google right now and is looking at the stats and seeing the predominance of consultants and investment bankers who are getting admitted. And this person works in, looks like revenue, advertisement at Google. So the question is it realistic to target Stanford or HBS as a person who has experience in advertisement in Google?
It's a great question, isn't it? Because of course,
yeah.
when we use these buckets and we say, well, it's about tech. Of course, you could be the chief financial officer of a firm, and your career is very much about finance, but with a tech label on that. And the schools, my colleagues at Fortuna talk about this, about being very sensitive to the actual position and areas of expertise and experience that you have. We actually have numbers. What is it for Harvard Business School? 13 of the admits had Google on their resume. Now, I have to say that Google had some of the most elaborate job titles. They had a lead mentor at the Google Launchpad Accelerator Program and deep mind engineers. Whereas at Microsoft, there were two titles. There was Project Manager 2 or Mechanical Engineer. That was it. So obviously Google has a lot of fun in the HR department coming up with these job titles. I think that the great majority of them would be tech focused. Now, of course, Google probably has one of the most impressive sales teams, certainly if you look at the sort of revenues they've been generating in the last 5 or 6 years. So, for you to leverage that and say, the position that I've held, I have had to be able to collaborate with some very technical minds and be able to make build that bridge between technology and the end user and the client. So, we don't see many with a straight sales role. I think many more would have a sort of a more strategic business development sort of hat on. But if you have, been able to play that sort of role and help the company to go into new markets or identify new opportunities even on the product side. I think that ability to have a dialogue across different parts of the company, your focus might be sales, but if you understand the underlying technology or can identify opportunities and bring those to the attention of senior executives at the firm, that's a great story to share with Stanford or any other top business school.
And at the bottom line is Google is a highly selective employer. It's very hard to get a job there. It is a gold standard company in this world. And even though you may not have a gold standard job for an MBA program like Harvard or Stanford, you can't take the other stuff away. And you should point out, I think in your application somewhere, how highly selective it was to get your job. Because the screen you pass through, John, that of course, is important.
These admissions offices, of course, these two schools are perhaps more closely followed than any other, and you follow them as closely as anybody that I know. That their admissions teams are actually fairly small. There's a core team, perhaps 6 or 7 individuals that are expected to have, regional market knowledge, whether that is, the top institutions at the Tsinghua and Fudan universities in China, the Oxfords and Cambridges in the UK, and or the top schools in Brazil and Chile, and similarly with employers. And I guess what you're describing, John, is if you were working for a successful but little known software firm in Bangalore versus working for Google out of Bangalore or Mumbai, you start, I guess, with that sort of, you have that head start that the admissions officer of these schools will recognize your employer. Now, the next step, obviously, is to be able to articulate and share the impact that you've had in your work. It's not enough. And I think, one of the core messages that I would leave with anybody, I was struck by one of my colleagues, a former associate director at Harvard Business School, would, conduct many hundreds of interviews. And she tells a story of Ivy League applicant, probably with a 3.7, 3.8 GPA, with the badge of one of these top firms that we've been discussing. And about 12 minutes into the 30-minute Harvard interview, he stops her and he says, I'm sorry, that's not the question that you should be asking. What you should be asking me is this. And then, of course, he proceeded to answer his own question. Now, my colleague at Fortuna, wearing her HBS hat as she then did, it took every ounce of effort not to just scroll rejected across that resume. Because no matter how smart you are, no matter who you work for and the schools that you graduated for, if you can't demonstrate humility in this entire process, then I think you're doomed to failure. It really is something that these schools look for.
Yep.
And Harvard has a problem. Harvard Business School has a problem. It's not visible to the outside world that sees a 90% yield into the MBA program. They have more money than they know what to build on that beautiful Boston campus of theirs. But somewhere along the line, with the whole change lives and change the worlds slogan that Stanford is identified with, they have caught the imagination of this generation. And though Harvard has a high yield, when they lose people, as inevitably they do, they typically lose them to Stanford, whether that's because of technology in the West Coast and innovation and good weather, I guess. But just in this idea that somewhere along the line, Stanford's almost identified as the good guys. And, it's telling. Chad has organized and made sure that when his team goes on the road to give those HBS info sessions, they talk about, don't think about yourself as one among 930 alpha personalities, type A competition. Think about yourself in a cohort or a section of 90 students and a level of collaboration and support. So I would say that, since Chad has arrived in the Harvard admissions office as the director there in the last, 3-4 years, he is truly looking for that level of humility, irrespective of the school or the companies that you've been to or worked with.
Here's another good question for you. So this person works at Deloitte in a business technology analyst role. And I know one of the more fascinating aspects of the study, which you really didn't get into all that much, is the second job phenomena. And this person is asking, is it better to have worked for another company after Deloitte and then apply or stay at the same firm, because Deloitte is still, it's a silver firm, it's not MBB?
Well, with a gold plate, because if you look at these numbers, Deloitte has outperformed the rest of the big four by a country mile.
That's for sure.
And building in, I guess, Monitor, that is also part of the Deloitte family. A couple of points to that one. One of the points of data that Theo identified was that, on average, consultants, whether McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Deloitte, or others, on average, they have 1 year fewer work experience than admits from other sectors. The flip side of that is that those coming from the military, as this slide explains, have typically between 2.5 or 3 years more experience than the rest of the incoming class. So I think one of the things you can draw from that is that whether at the first stage and then staying at that firm or making a switch, there's this sense that you've often got tremendous industry breadth working in the consulting firms. And if you're one of those that has quickly been given levels of responsibility, and you have recommenders that can talk about why you were given this particular project, how you managed to connect with senior executive clients, I don't actually think that it makes that much difference. The movement that we saw in the investment banks is much less at the consulting firms, and over a 3 or 4 year period, these admissions offices clearly feel that those on a fast track are building that level of responsibility and demonstrating leadership potential. So no, I don't see in the numbers this need to move on. What we often see, I think, after 2-3 years, the schools are probably quite interested by those that make a move that also has a sense of purpose. And an example might be, the consultant 2-3 years into their career that then joins a microfinance bank, or they join the Obama or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've had this wonderful first step in their career, clearly want to have impact, and have made a very conscious decision, to join an organization like that. I suspect that in the 2 or 3 years, as they then stand at that step of their career, I suspect that their next employer, they might even have a head start in terms of the job title that they negotiate. They see a very smart, capable individual, and the role that they first interviewed for might get a little bit of title inflation. But yeah, you can stay at Deloitte provided that you're on that fast track.
Stay put. Actually, I think one of the big surprises of the stats out of here is how strong Deloitte showed up on both top lists, much higher than I would have imagined. So, hey, we are out of time. And I know we can go on and on about this because this is so fascinating. We have so many questions that are going to be left unanswered. Maybe what we can do is I'm going to send you the questions, and we can put them online somehow, answer them.
Sounds good.
And I'm just going to point out that if you want one of these detailed reports or both of them, Fortuna is making them available for free. All you got to do is turn in your email address. Now, if you turn in your email address, are you going to hound these people for business or something, or what?
Hey, I encourage them to take a look through. I mean, you talked about elitism. There's a degree of eclectic. There are so many profiles, and we spent hours, days, weeks working on these. And to look at the stories of the architect from Uruguay, or the person working in agritech in the Midwest, I have an even deeper respect for the work of these admissions offices. I know that there are some choices that you identify there as being the softer or the easy choices for them to make, and how it creates this kind of bubble. But nevertheless, they're reading anywhere between 8,000 and 9,500 applications, and the time that they must take to identify some of these stories. One guy out of Nigeria running a laundry firm after first steps of his career in McKinsey. Gotta love that story. So please reach out for a copy of those deep dives. We've tried to just open them up and share as many of those job titles and experiences and all of those personal stories, and would love to spend time with you finding out what your stories are too.
So I've looked over these reports, and they're really detailed and they're really worthwhile. And because they're free, I mean, come on, you want to get them. And in fact, at Poets&Quants, we have abbreviated versions, stories based on the reports. If you want to look at them, just go to Google, say Poets&Quants, feeder colleges and companies to Harvard Business School, or feeder companies and colleges to Stanford. You'll find our very slim, sparse synopsis reports with, incidentally, links to the Fortuna site, so you can go right to them and get the actually detailed reports. And if you're going to apply to Harvard or Stanford or have any interest in them, I really recommend that you get them, because you're not paying a penny for them. And maybe Matt will call you up and try to get you as a client, but big deal, who cares? Matt's a nice guy, and you can say, no, Matt, I don't have the money for you.
Just as happy as if they join us by live stream or in person in London at the end of April.
And Matt, I think this stuff is so fascinating that I wonder if you and I should conduct a session on it at Center Court in London. Well, think about it.
Well, of course, we've got many of the top schools, a lot of the top European schools. So I think we've got the time to put together a couple of deep dives for INSEAD, London Business School.
That's true.
And we can present those findings at the London event.
Be cool, actually. Yeah. All right. Hey, thank you for joining us. This recording will be posted on the site. I think we'll also do a transcript, and we're going to take all the questions that have been asked, and Matt and I will try to answer them as quickly as we can, and also post that as well. All right, this is John Byrne with Poets&Quants. Matt, thank you so much for joining us in Paris and for doing this incredible research. I'm blown away by it, and I'm a little jealous that we didn't do it ourselves.
At least we're now doing it together, right? So thanks for the time and the great questions. And yeah, we'll try and get to all those questions offline, put something together for the Poets site.
And for all of you who actually hit the send button today or yesterday on the Harvard Business School application, because the actual deadline was at the moment we started our webinar. Good luck to all of you. We really wish you the best.
Yeah. Glad that one did. Wharton Booth, Stanford in the next 48 hours.
Indeed.
Great.
All right. Good luck to everyone. And thanks for joining us.